Hello, good evening, and welcome to Scotland at 7 on Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Ruth Watson. My guest this evening is Maureen Watt, SNP MSP for Aberdeen South and North Kincardine. Hello, Maureen. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Good evening. How are you doing?
Aye, chavin awa. Just keep it Doric for you if it like. So I'll go through the headlines of the news first, and then we'll go back to Maureen and go through the stories of the day. Ukraine update, day 260. Ukrainian forces were closing on the outskirts of Kherson city as Russia said today it had begun its retreat from the southern city announced last night. Hours after claiming the liberation of the key town of Snurivka, images are emerged of relaxed-looking soldiers from Ukraine's 28th Mechanized Brigade with a Ukrainian flag in Kislivka, a village just outside Klapaya and about 15 kilometres from Kherson's city centre. There are more than 600 fossil fuel lobbyists at the COP27 climate conference, a rise of more than 25% from last year, and outnumbering any one frontline community affected by the climate crisis. Nicola Sturgeon has met Rishi Sunak ahead of the British-Irish Council Summit in Blackpool. Following yesterday's vote for strike action by nurses across the UK, today EIS teachers in Scotland and UK civil servants in Whitehall and frontline services have also voted for industrial action over the cost of living crisis. New figures released today by the Trussell Trust reveal that more than 116,000 emergency food parcels were provided to people from April until September this year by food banks in the charity's network in Scotland, a 34% rise in food bank use. Social Justice Secretary Shona Robeson has restated the Scottish Government's firm opposition to proposed reforms to the UK Human Rights Act, urging civil society groups to continue campaigning against the plans. The UK government has been warned that public services in the UK require at least £43 billion a year in additional funding just to stand still among the fallout from soaring inflation. 4 people have been jailed in connection with trafficking offences at the High Court in Glasgow yesterday. 4 men who were previously convicted of human trafficking and brothel-keeping offences were jailed for various periods of time. President Biden thinks Twitter boss Elon Musk's relationship with other countries is worthy of being looked at. The Taliban have banned Afghan women from entering the capital's public parks and fun fairs just months after ordering access to be segregated by gender. A world champion beatboxer, the first woman to row solo across the Indian Ocean, and the First Minister of Scotland are among 55 female firsts whose portraits will be coming to the University of St Andrews this winter. Well, to go back to the beginning of the news now, we'll go through the Ukraine update and then come to Maureen Watt for her analysis and comment. The Ukrainian forces were closing on the outskirts of Kherson city as Russia said it had begun its retreat from the southern city announced last night. Hours after claiming the liberation of the key town of Snurivka, images emerged of relaxed-looking soldiers from Ukraine's 28th Mechanized Brigade with a Ukrainian flag in Kislivka, a village just outside Klapaya, and about 15 kilometres from Kherson city centre. While Russia did not formally declare it was abandoning Kherson, all signs point to a Moscow retreat. Ukraine's army chief, Valery Zaluzhny, said Kyiv could not yet confirm whether Russia was indeed pulling out of the city, but that Ukrainian troops had advanced 7 kilometres in the past 24 hours and recaptured 12 settlements. The Ukrainian victory in Kherson is a significant blow to the Russian President Vladimir Putin only weeks after a high-profile ceremony in Moscow in which he announced the forever annexation of the Kherson region along with 3 other regions. President Biden said Russia's withdrawal of troops from Kherson was evidence that its military had real problems, while NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said Russia's retreat was part of an overall pattern, demonstrating that Moscow had absolutely lost the momentum. Mr. Stoltenberg said Putin made several huge mistakes when he invaded, including underestimating NATO's ability to support Ukraine. Russia's loss of Kherson West Bank will likely prevent its forces from achieving their strategic aspiration of a land bridge reaching Odessa, according to the UK Ministry of Defence. America's top general and chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff estimates that Russia's military had seen more than 100,000 of its soldiers killed and wounded in Ukraine. The UK government said today that it had frozen assets worth £18 billion held by Russian oligarchs, other individuals, and entities sanctioned for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The global dash for gas amid the Ukraine war will accelerate climate breakdown and could send temperatures soaring far beyond the 1.5 centigrade limit of safety if all of the new gas projects announced in response to the global gas supply crunch are fulfilled. The deputy head of the Russian-installed administration in the Kherson region died in a car crash, state news agencies reported, citing local Russian-backed officials. Kirill Stremozov, previously an anti-vaccine blogger and political marginal, had emerged as one of the most prominent faces of the Russian occupation of Ukraine. President Putin posthumously decorated Stremozov with the Order of Courage, the Kremlin said on Wednesday. Senior UN officials were planning to meet members of a high-level Russian delegation in Geneva on Friday to discuss extending the Ukraine grain deal. The Russian Foreign Ministry said Moscow had contact with US officials from time to time and confirmed there would soon be US-Russia consultations on the New START nuclear arms reduction treaty, the last remaining arms control agreement between the world's two largest nuclear powers. Well, Maureen, there's an awful lot to unpick from that bevy of news coming out of Ukraine today. Well, let's start with the last story first. I mean, where do you think the nuclear talks need to go, and where does the SNP's commitment to have a nuclear-free Scotland after Scottish independence, how do you think this all kind of ties in, sort of with the importance, perhaps, of a nuclear-free world, or less a nuclear-free Scotland?
Well, I think when there's a war on, particularly when it's in Europe and there's a big superpower like Russia involved, kind of knee-jerk reaction is that we all need nuclear weapons. But they are so, who's going to use them? There's always this threat of using them. And it's like threatening a child with taking away treats and not carrying it through. The threat is just, to me, meaningless. So we have got to start a process of denuclearization of weapons in order for the whole world, I think, to move on. I mean, think of the huge amounts, billions and billions of money that is spent on nuclear weapons, and here in the UK, upgrading our nuclear weapon system, which, by the way, of course, isn't our system anyway. It's linked so much to the US. So think if that money could be spent on other subjects that we're going on to speak about tonight, the health service and paying people decent incomes. It's just so necessary that we carry through on some of the denuclearization. I'm sure it will be a very slow process and it'll be very small steps, but it really must start, in my view.
I have to declare an interest as somebody who spent a couple of years living at Faslane Peace Camp. I wholeheartedly agree with you. But the other side of the nuclear question, which has been brought into focus with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is their apparent willingness to use radiation and the threat of radiation as a weapon of war. Looking at, for example, the way in which they keep cutting off power to the nuclear power stations in Ukraine, which of course in itself is a concern. As we look at energy, the crisis that has sort of come into play across Europe, as the Nord Stream project, for example, as the gas coming from Russia, it really seems to be sort of highlighting our gas dependency. And as we're looking at COP27, we're looking at trying to stop the rise over 1.5. What do you think Scotland and Europe needs to do in order to perhaps hit the reset button in our energy usage and our energy focus. Some people say that nuclear power is the answer. Others obviously disagree with that.
There's a lot to unpick in what you've said, Ruth. If we stick with nuclear, other countries in Europe are very much more wedded to nuclear than obviously we are in Scotland, which we're not. And if you were to move away from nuclear, as Germany, for example, have done without having other sources in power, and as we see now, relying on gas, it comes a bit unstuck. Although I think they're coping pretty well in terms of making sure that buildings and everything, degrees of temperature are turned down, shutting off lighting at night, and all the sorts of things that we could be taking if we wanted to, but are not, to reduce our consumption of gas. And then, contrast it with France and obviously Ukraine, where, the reliance on nuclear is obviously much higher. So I think the answer is that we need to have a mix of energy sources. We're not going to go to renewables overnight or, within the decade, although Scotland, as we all know, is leading the world in moving towards renewables and has enough electricity, 100% in electricity, some of which is exported. So there's a long way to go. In Scotland, we have said that we will need oil and gas for some considerable time more. But it's really important that we have a mix. And in Scotland, of course, we're in a much better position where we have hydro, offshore wind, onshore wind. Tidal is still very much in development. And of course, solar, and you don't need the sun shining all the time for solar. So, and of course, battery storage and hydrogen are also now in the mix. So we're very fortunate in Scotland, but I think it highlights that other countries must look to that as well. And nuclear is obviously very precarious, and there was always threats to nuclear power stations, and to me, they're still very dangerous, and I wouldn't like them in our mix. I know in the UK they want to keep nuclear power stations and build some more, but I'm glad that the First Minister is resisting any attempts by the UK government to build any in Scotland.
Well, moving on to the First Minister and her representation of Scotland at Sharm el-Sheikh. There are more than 600 fossil fuel lobbyists at the COP27 climate conference, a rise of more than 25% from last year, and outnumbering any one frontline community affected by the climate crisis. There are 636 lobbyists from the oil and gas industries registered to attend the United Nations event in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. At Glasgow, the figure was only 503, which outnumbered the delegation of any single country. This year, the only country with a larger delegation is the United Arab Emirates, hosts of COP28 next year, which has 1,070 registered delegates, up from 176 last year. The data on lobbyists, combined by the organisation's Corporate Accountability, Global Witness and Corporate Europe Observatory, shows a growing influence of oil and gas interests at the climate talks. While many environmental groups hoping to encourage the transition away from fossil fuels say it can be beneficial to bring private interests to the negotiating table, these benefits risk being outweighed by the sheer size of the delegations and suspicions that lobbyists attend the talks to slow progress rather than discuss limiting their own industries. Civil society groups fear that the increasing presence of the fossil fuel lobbyists risk stymieing negotiations at an essential time, and amid efforts to keep global temperature rises within the 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming scientists agree is needed to prevent catastrophic climate change. Scottish Greens Environment spokesman Mark Russell, MSP, said, "Having fossil fuel lobbyists at a climate summit is like inviting Dracula to a blood bank. They will sink their fangs into anything with a profit without ever looking at themselves in the mirror." They aren't attending COP in record numbers because they want to tackle the climate crisis. They are doing it because they want to continue with business as usual and the same terrible policies that have led us to this point. Maureen, have you had a chance to follow any of what's been going on at the COP26? Sorry, COP27. It's noticeable that the First Minister has been welcomed. She's been a very active presence in Egypt and uh, seems to have been fairly instrumental in some of the conversations and discussions that have been ongoing, which hasn't always met with appreciation or approval by some of the commentators I've seen. What importance do you think there is to the First Minister and, for example, Susan Aitken from Glasgow City Council going over? I saw Kay Burley challenging the First Minister about that today.
I think it's so childish and churlish of people objecting to Scotland's First Minister being there, and indeed the leader of Glasgow, who hosted last year's. I mean, in terms of handover and continuity, surely, from any other country, people would be expected to be there, especially since the leadership in the UK is not showing the same commitment to COP and its aims. But on the wider points that you make, Ruth, about COP27, it's obviously not getting as much coverage in the mainstream media as the meeting last year because it was on our own turf. But some of the things that have been going on, like the First Minister talking on fringes, because obviously she's not there as a head of state yet. I welcome the day when she will be there as a head of state. She has been, and the Scottish Government have been quite vocal and quite to the forefront on loss and damage for countries that are experiencing catastrophic climate change effects due to high emissions from more advanced countries in the West, China and India and others. So I welcome the First Minister's presence at COP, and I think despite what we hear in the mainstream media, her presence does go down well with delegates. In relation to your other point about more the people who are delegates to COP and the big companies and oil and gas lobbyists, they always manage to wheedle their way into gatherings like this. The oil and gas lobby, and I know myself, is very, very well organized and very strong. And one could be benign and hope that they're going there to learn and find out the effects on other countries. But are they, going to get open ears to what they've got to say? I doubt it when there are so many smaller countries there, island communities, that are literally disappearing because of greenhouse gas emissions. So I hope the lobbyists, the big lobbyists, are put in their place, and all the smaller countries who never get a chance to be listened to on a world stage are given their due place there.
It's interesting because one does hear criticisms of the amount of people going out to the COP conferences. And yesterday I was listening to a debate where somebody was saying, well, perhaps it should just be the leaders that go rather than having all these the side committees and side conversations. And yet I can't help thinking that actually it's in the side meetings where, for example, the smaller countries can get together and have the conversations that the big lobbyists aren't particularly interested in taking part in. And for example, if the First Minister with the leading Scotland leading the way with the first 5 million in terms of reparation and support, which then encouraged other countries to follow suit. I mean, if a country like Scotland, which is really making a very considered decision to move into renewables and to look at alternatives, can say, well, actually, this is the way that we want to do it. it perhaps is one of those opportunities to sit down with like-minded people and hit the reset button. And I was interested in what you were saying about other European countries, the ways in which people are trying to deal with for example, the lack of power because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the changing habits. And I mean, can you see that there's some perhaps way in which this very difficult winter ahead for many of us will be looked at as a way of perhaps hitting the reset button and changing habits in a way which is um, perhaps helpful going forward for the climate emergency?
Well, I think the current economic crisis, and the which part of which is the rise in oil and gas prices, has made us rethink um, what we're going to do in terms of our usage, and perhaps even make some people rethink about what our sources of energy are going to be at home. Um, so I think it's very small steps, and I don't think we make it easy for people to make those changes. There could be a reset button, though, Ruth, in the budget statement, um, whenever that is coming. Is it next week or the week thereafter? Because we were told post COVID that we can't keep on doing the same things over and over again as we've done in the past, that we need to make big changes. I'm not holding my breath, but it'd be good if we did start to see changes in the way we do things and the way we run our economy, to take into account global warming, to take into account the huge inequalities in wealth. But I'm not holding my breath.
Well, there's a potential perhaps for another reset button being hit. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon is meeting Rishi Sunak in Blackpool today ahead of the scheduled British Irish Council summit. This will be the first meeting with a UK Prime Minister since before Boris Johnson left office. I've actually lost track of how many Prime Ministers that is. Liz Truss, who had said she would ignore Scotland's First Minister during her campaign to win the leadership of the Conservative Party, did not pick up the phone to speak to Nicola Sturgeon once in the 50 days that she was in office. Rishi Sunak says he's keen to he's keen to reset the relationship, and did manage to telephone after becoming Prime Minister. However, he seems less keen to discuss a Section 30 order of an independence referendum next year. I mean, it's very hard to see Rishi Sunak in some ways being Prime Minister in a year or two's time. He sort of seems to be fading fast. He didn't even seem to remember Prime Minister's questions yesterday that he was the Prime Minister when he had to respond to Keir Starmer. And what is your view of the current sort of fiasco that's really going on down in Westminster? I mean, that's quite a strong way to put it, but it's very hard to take seriously current. I mean, it's desperately serious, and yet it's very hard to kind of hold out any hope, really. But perhaps I'm being cynical. Do you think that there's better days ahead?
Well, I think on your point about what's happening at Westminster, yes, it's absolutely awful. But to be perfectly honest, we need some stability. I mean, three prime ministers in what was it is 3 months is absolutely unheard of and absolutely awful. I mean, the international community is just laughing at us, which is why, of course, we need to be away from Westminster as soon as possible and have our own government. But on one level, I really do think that there is a need for stability for the whole of the UK, and there isn't going to be an general election anytime soon. The date is about this time in 2024, I think, which is the latest that they can have one. So I hope they have one not in the winter months like the 2019 was. It was awful canvassing in that weather. So, in one level, I want to see stability, and I want to see what this mini budget will bring. So, in a way, I want Sunak honestly to stay and then get shoved out and given the Tories roundly beaten in the next general election, which I'm sure they will be. But in terms of the meeting, I mean, I haven't heard what Rishi Sunak is saying about the meeting, but the first impressions that the First Minister gave was that it was constructive, and she looked forward to further dialogue. And I think she will have hammered home the terrible crisis facing families, the terrible crisis and unsustainable crisis facing the NHS, and will also have raised the issue of the Supreme Court judgment and how he thinks that Scottish voters can have democracy in Scotland. So I look forward to hearing a further resume of the meeting from both the Prime Minister and the First Minister, which I'm sure we'll get in the coming hours.
It's very it's very stark when you hear of the three treasurers that there have now been, one of them being Rishi Sunak, and then of course Kwasi Kwarteng, and well, now Jeremy Hunt, the cuts that look likely to be facing us already with a sort of shredded budget. It's and yet nobody seems to talk about the 37 billion that went missing with Dido Harding's test and trace system, and that often confuses me. That's a vast amount of money, and you know, coming on to the following story about the strike actions that are sort of coming with this Tory winter of discontent. That money, that sort of the money that just disappeared and has never been spoken of again, would have filled, I think, all of that hole, if my maths is correct. Following yesterday's vote for strike action by nurses across the UK, EIS teachers in Scotland and UK civil servants in Whitehall and frontline services have voted for industrial action over the cost of living crisis. Civil servants running public services, from passports to pensions, have voted to take strike action, joining a wave of stoppages expected to hit the UK as workers fight to protect their living standards in the face of double-digit inflation. The Public and Commercial Services Union, the PCS, announced on Thursday that the threshold for strike action had been hit in 126 public sector workplaces, covering 100,000 workers. It represents civil servants who work in Whitehall or in frontline services such as job centres, and had balloted 150,000 members. Civil servants are just the latest group of exasperated workers voting to strike rather than accept deep cuts in their living standards, in what appears likely to be the biggest wave of industrial action in the UK for decades. The backdrop to this latest vote is a dispiriting combination of long-term pay restraint, the challenges of working in overstretched public services, and the long shadow of the COVID pandemic. Many of the workers backing strike action are those who kept public services running through the lockdowns of 2020 and 2021, perhaps fueling their resentment at the prospect of real-term pay cuts. Public sector workers have repeatedly borne the brunt of spending cuts over the past 12 years. George Osborne, now back in Downing Street as an advisor, imposed a pay freeze from 2011 to 2013, followed by a 1% pay cap for the 4 years after that. The cap was lifted in 2018, only to be reimposed in 2020 as the cost of battling the COVID pandemic strained the public finances. Double-digit inflation means that workers whose living standards have been consistently squeezed for more than a decade now face a significant real terms cut in wages. I mean, it's absolutely catastrophic when you've got the Royal College of Nurses, who I think have only the BBC was just saying that they'd never been on strike before, but I think they did go on strike in the 1950s briefly. I mean, it is unheard of, and the nursing staff that I've heard speaking predominantly are saying that they're doing this because they are so concerned that the cuts to nursing, the impact on them is actually affecting patient health and well-being, that they're really going on strike not just to protect themselves, but to protect our loved ones, the people that they look after. And where do you see the current wave of strike actions leading? Because I mean, it seems hard to think that this very neoliberalist uh, Tory government will back down and give any concessions.
Well, if they don't, in this budget statement, which is coming up in the next few weeks, then we are definitely heading to a very serious winter of discontent, in my view. All these pay claims, in my view, are legitimate. Britain is supposed to be one of the 10 richest countries in the world, fifth or sixth or whatever it is. Even although we're so very rich, people have been living in austerity since the banking crisis of 2008, basically. And of course, the cost of living crisis is really caught up with people before up till now. And you get the feeling that up till now that they've really put up with it, but now it's just broken the camel's back, whether it be in the health service, which has also had to deal with COVID, or in other areas where there have been cuts after cuts to workforce and people have been having to do more work for less and seen their incomes and their earning power eroded over a decade and more. So it's little wonder that we've come to this tipping point, if you like. So the UK government have to recognise the feelings of the populace, because if you listen to Vox Pops, most people are supporting the strikers and what they're looking for. So it is up to the Westminster government, because as John Swinney rightly said, there's no more money in the Scottish pot, which has a fixed budget. And if there are going to be pay increases without extra money from Westminster, then that money is going to have to come from other areas in the health service, in the education service, and so on. So we really are in a really bad situation, and only Westminster can begin to sort that out. We can make our own decisions once we get that extra money, but it's up to Westminster to sort it out. Which is why this budget statement in the coming weeks is so very, very important. And as you say, whether they get it right or not remains to be seen. And it's little wonder that we're not very confident that the correct decisions will be made.
Can you explain, please, a little for those viewers who perhaps aren't aware of Scotland's budget and the way in which that works? Because, you know, I mean, politicians like yourself are always advocating for Scottish independence, and yet here you are saying that you need money from Westminster to sort the problem out. Can you explain for those viewers who perhaps aren't aware of the funding constraints on Scotland's government, why can't Scotland just sort it out?
Well, as I said, Scotland gets a fixed budget from Westminster, and over the past few years, the increase in the monetary amount has not kept pace with inflation. So the actual amount of money that there to be spent is less. The Scottish government has very limited, very, very limited borrowing powers and very, very limited tax raising powers. That's in contrast to the UK government that can borrow whatever it likes. And actually, other countries, when they've been faced with crises like this, have invested, put billions into the economies, into the hands of working people in order to stimulate the economy that way. The UK government talks about growth, but you get the feeling that it's about giving its pals extra money to maybe increase their businesses a bit. But if you give people who have less money more money in their hands, then they're going to go out and spend it in the shops. They're going to spend it in the pubs and on leisure and in the furniture shops and what have you. They're going to spend it locally, and it's money in the hands of ordinary working people that will stimulate an economy. And that seems to be lost in the Westminster government and in the Chancellery of the Exchequer, because they don't seem to see that. They still believe in this fairy tale of trickle-down economics, which has failed decade after decade.
Yeah, I mean, it was even quite derided by President Biden, I believe, when trickle down was the Americans seemed to be quite concerned that the Kwarteng's approach was going to bring down the global economy. It's very shocking.
Obama invested huge amounts of money post the financial crisis in 2008, I think it was. Hope I'm getting my dates right. And they managed to get the US economy back on track much, much quicker. As I say, we've never managed to get it back on track, and living in austerity is really this has just become far too much for people in what is supposed to be a rich country.
It was pretty grim when you think how many nurses now, for example, the hospitals are bringing in food banks and clothing banks into hospitals because the staff working there aren't getting paid enough. And new figures released today by the Trussell Trust reveal that more than 116,000 emergency food parcels were provided to people from April until September this year by food banks in the charities network in Scotland, and 40,000 of these went to children. This represents the most parcels ever distributed for children by the Trussell Trust's Scotland network during a period when every child under 6 years old living in a household with a low income was entitled to an additional £20 a week from the Scottish Child Payment Scheme. Overall, 34% more parcels were provided than compared to the same period last year, and 3% more than during the first 6 months of the pandemic in 2020-21. These rises make this the busiest 6 months on record for food banks in the Trussell Trust's Scotland network for this time of year. Almost 1.3 million emergency food parcels were provided to people facing hardship across the UK in that period. The Trussell Trust which supports 121 food bank centres in Scotland, says the cost of living emergency has created a tsunami of need as people struggle to survive amidst the soaring cost of living. With the need outstripping donations for the first time in its history, the charity has been forced to launch its first ever emergency appeal to ensure that food banks can meet the alarming level of need in their communities. Over the last 6 months, 27,000 people have been forced to turn to a food bank in the Trussell Trust Scotland network for the first time, which represents a 33% increase compared to 2021. Chris Stevens MP, who helped create affordable food projects in Glasgow, has said the Scottish Government, alongside numerous organisations, are tackling poverty and inequality with one hand tied behind their back, as Westminster policies and actions continue to undermine work being done in Scotland. Commenting, the Glasgow South West MP, who sits on the Work and Pensions Committee, said, "Food bank use has risen dramatically since the Tories came to power in 2010, while the SNP Scottish Government has been doing what it can with its limited powers to tackle poverty and inequality, Westminster policies continue to undermine our hard work." The Scottish Child Payment was described as a game changer by anti-poverty campaigners. What do you think more can be done to support people now that the Scottish Government has taken over the welfare payments in many areas? What direction do you think? I mean, when you are considering the challenges ahead, what policies do you think are needed, and why do you think the Scottish Government approach is one which is the direction that is being taken?
Well, people seem to forget that the Scottish Government is not there to mitigate the mistakes and the problems created by Westminster, but they're so bad and having such an awful effect on ordinary people's lives that we're having to do that. I mean, Scotland has its own anti-poverty strategy, which is being blown out of the water really because of what is happening with Westminster. So, the Scottish Government will continue to work with councils to provide free breakfasts for children, free school lunches, and as you mentioned, Ruth, increase the child payment. But all this is really tinkering round the edges when you've got a tax and benefits system which doesn't obviously work for ordinary people if the rise in food bank use is 34%. Something is clearly wrong with the tax and benefits system. And again, I come back to this budget statement. It really has to be seen to be doing something about that and getting more money into people's hands, because people have so many fixed commitments, whether it be mortgage, paying off a car, or whatever, that you can see why food is something that is first. Food and heat are first to go, and people have to resort to food banks and now warm banks.
Well, as the Scottish Government looks at the Good Food Nation Bill and food becoming a human right as in law in Scotland, the Scottish Government's Social Justice Secretary, Shona Robeson, has restated the Scottish Government's firm opposition to proposed reforms to the UK Human Rights Act, urging civil society groups to continue campaigning against the plans. I mean, I'm very concerned, in the work that I do, at the repeal of the EU laws, which may well see many of the rights that are in law through our time in the EU being stripped away, from maternity leave to parental leave to work conditions. And the UK government repeatedly seems to be interested in stepping away from the Human Rights Act. And when you see the way that the Hertfordshire police yesterday were arresting journalists for going about their business, you can see why perhaps the UK government is interested in stepping away from human rights. What are your concerns in regard to the reforms, so-called reforms to the Human Rights Act that the UK government is considering, and indeed some of the other aspects of the increasingly authoritarian way that it seems to be behaving in terms of the laws being brought in about criticizing journalists can be jailed for criticizing the government?
In short, I don't think it can be fixed. I think that Westminster, this right-wing Westminster government, is on a trajectory that cannot be fixed. So the sooner, we can't really wait another 2 years to have a referendum and halt this in Scotland, because so many rights will be taken away. And these are things that nothing the Scottish Government could do could mitigate, because all of these are things reserved still to Westminster. So to me, it means that more and more people must surely see that the trajectory of Westminster, even under Keir Starmer, because we've seen his views on immigration over this last weekend, the whole of Westminster is on a trajectory that I think is in complete opposite to what the people of Scotland have voted for and voted in an SNP government. And to me, the only solution to this is a referendum, a vote for independence, and go our own way in Scotland.
And do you really think that the promise that this would be held within the lifetime of this Holyrood government, do you really think that that is now looking likely? I mean, we've got time's a ticking. We've got the Supreme Court waiting to hand out their judgment, and there are those who say that would just leave a very short period of time for campaigning before next October.
Well, I'm out canvassing very regularly, and I see people's views changing, and we can see that the Westminster government are getting increasingly anxious about how a referendum would go this time, because they're obviously doing their own polling as well, and I think Tommy Shepherd has asked them to share that with us, since it's done with taxpayers' money. But we'll have, of course, to wait for the Supreme Court judgment. The media obviously say nothing; it's not going to happen. I'm perhaps a little bit more optimistic, but if not, then the Scottish Government's view is clear. We hope that the Supreme Court vote is in favour of Scottish democracy, or democracy in Scotland, and that we have the referendum, and then if not, the next Westminster election will be an independence election.
Well, time will tell. Looking at what's happening across the pond. President Biden, who's just been going through his own election cycle at the moment, says he thinks that Twitter boss Elon Musk's relationships with other countries is worthy of being looked at. The president was asked at a news conference on Wednesday whether he thought Musk was a threat to national security and if his acquisition of Twitter with help from a Saudi Arabian conglomerate should be investigated by the US government. I think that Elon Musk's cooperation and or technical relationship with other countries is worthy of being looked at, said President Biden. Whether he's doing anything inappropriate, I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting they're worth being looked at. Saudi Prince Al Walid bin Talal, among the richest Middle East investors, and his investment firm has emerged as the second largest investor in Twitter after Musk's takeover of the social media platform. Two US Senators, Democrat Ron Wyden, who chairs the Finance Committee, and Chris Murphy of Connecticut, last week called for a thorough vetting of the Twitter deal. In a statement, Wyden said, "Given the Saudi regime's history of jailing critics, planting a spy at Twitter, and brutally murdering a Washington Post journalist, the Saudi regime must be blocked from accessing Twitter account information, direct messages, and other data that could be used to identify political opponents or to suppress criticism of the royal family." Musk's purchase of Twitter has sparked concerns that he could face pressure from countries trying to control freedom of speech online. The world's richest man, Musk is CEO of electric car maker Tesla, which operates a factory in Shanghai that accounted for about half of Tesla's global deliveries last year. Musk is also CEO of rocket and satellite internet company SpaceX, among others. Musk has previously suggested that tensions between China and Taiwan could be resolved by handing over some control of Taiwan to Beijing. He also proposed Ukraine permanently cede Crimea to Russia, while saying SpaceX could not indefinitely fund Starlink services in Ukraine, although I believe the Ukrainians have countered that by saying that they actually pay for the services. Um, this does raise a number of really serious issues about freedom of speech and who controls truth and honesty within the media. We've already seen the way in which for Carol Cadwallader's work in exposing the role of Cambridge Analytica, for example, potentially affecting outcomes with the Brexit referendum and with the election of Trump and others around the world. Do you think that it's time that the world perhaps came to an agreement on the way in which social media companies are held accountable and perhaps have internationally agreed standards, or is that a step too far?
Well, it would be nice if there could be such agreement, but I think that's a bit pie in the sky. And we've seen, with the UK coming out of Europe, that anything that the EU is trying to move along the lines of taxing um, Amazon and online companies, for example, and looking at these issues. But again, the UK is completely isolated. I look forward to the United States Senate or House of Representatives looking into vetting the Twitter deal. But I think we need to put this in perspective, Ruth. It's only something like 10% of the world's population that's on Twitter, for example. So it is a bit of a, Twitterati speaking to Twitterati. But it highlights to me why political parties like ourselves in the SNP need to be out there knocking doors and speaking to people, and treating Twitter as it is it's a kind of echo chamber, if you like. And I think more and more people will abandon it if it is not seen as some thing that is open and transparent, and people like Elon Musk start you know charging for parts of Twitter or whatever. So I think we need to watch this space, but I think governments need to be very mindful of what's going on.
It's the two last stories that I'll be coming to this evening are looking at women and women's place in the world. And one of the concerns I heard yesterday was that the the rise of the women's movement, the anti-hijab movement in Iran was being very much, that a lot of the wave of activism and support that had come around from that had come about through platforms like Twitter. So I guess while there is the bubble aspect of it, it's interesting. I'm sure that sociologists will talk a great deal in the years to come about the role that social media has to play in sort of citizen campaigning, because here we've got the Taliban have just banned Afghan women from entering the capital's public parks and fun fairs just months after ordering access to be segregated by gender. The new rule introduced this week further squeezes women out of an ever-shrinking public space. They are already banned from travelling without a male escort and forced to wear a hijab or burqa whenever out of the home. Secondary schools for girls have also been shut for over a year across most of the country. The news was met with dismay by women and park operators who have invested heavily in developing the facilities. There are no schools, no work. We should at least have a place to have fun, said one woman as she watched her children play in a park through the window of an adjoining restaurant. A few miles away, the Ferris wheel and most of the rides in Zazai Park, which offers a spectacular view of Kabul, had ground to a sudden halt because of lack of business. Before this week's ban, it could accommodate hundreds of visitors on days when women brought their children for family gatherings. On Fridays and public holidays, even more people would flock to the park, one of the few attractions in the city. And kind of the other side of the coin, with women being appreciated and celebrated. An exhibition celebrates 100 years of trailblazing women in Scotland. A world champion beatboxer, the first woman to roll solo across the Indian Ocean, and the First Minister of Scotland are among 55 female firsts whose portraits will be coming to the University of St Andrews this winter. First Women UK features portraits by acclaimed photographer Anita Corbin and celebrates Britain's modern female pioneers, those who achieved a first in their field of achievement. The series covers a wide range of disciplines, including sport, literature, music, the arts, science, politics, faith, and the military. Created over the course of a decade, it was first exhibited in 2018 to celebrate 100 years since the vote was first extended to women. This will be the first time the series has been displayed in Scotland. The series has close links to Scotland, featuring First Minister Nicola Sturgeon and Argyll-born Moira Cameron, the first woman to become a beefeater at the Tower of London. It also has a special reason for coming to St Andrews, as it features former Principal and Vice-Chancellor of the University, Professor Dame Louise Richardson, as the first woman to hold that role, as well as honorary graduates, including Betty Boothroyd, the first woman to become the Speaker of the House of Commons, and Professor Dame Sally Davies, the first female Chief Medical Officer for England. Principal and Vice-Chancellor Professor Dame Sally Mapstone, FRSE, said, "The First Women UK collection provides a wonderful insight into the achievements of women over the last 100 years and celebrates those who have taken the lead so that others can follow." First Women UK will be displayed at the Wardlaw Museum and the Laidlaw Music Centre in St Andrews from Sunday the 13th of November 2022 to Sunday the 8th of January 2023. Entry is free. Well, those two stories really highlight such a difference between the lives facing women um, here in Scotland and in countries where oppression is sadly instituted in law. What do you think we can do as a nation where women's rights, the battle's not over yet, but we're well ahead, well along the road towards equality. What do you think we can do, and what do you think our responsibilities are to those countries and those cultures where women are still being oppressed? I mean, do you think that this yet again highlights a need for humane asylum policies and safe routes for women who need to come, you know, maybe need to get to Scotland in safe places? What can we do while celebrating our rights and our freedoms when we realise there are still women facing oppression across the world?
I think that's great that Scotland is seen as a safe haven, and that we've taken more than our fair share of UK refugees from Ukraine and from Syria and other countries. And I hope that what people learn in this country about how we treat women, whereas not completely okay in many cases, is far and away better than some of these other countries. But as we've seen in Iran, women themselves are rising up, and hopefully their menfolk will join them. And I think in Kabul, if the men have to always take the children to the park, that's not going to happen in most societies, I don't think. And we'll see the women and the children ganging up on the men to say this is not acceptable. And hopefully the Taliban regime will become again unacceptable in Afghanistan.
And in terms of the celebration of the female firsts exhibition in St Andrews, do you think this is something that will get perhaps the high profile it perhaps deserves? Will you be able to go along?
Well, I hope it gets the high profile that it deserves. I will try and go along. It would be much better if it went on the road after it's been in St Andrews and moved around the country, so that more and more people could see it. But I'm sure it's going to be very interesting, and I will make an effort, as I'm sure lots of people will, to go and see it. And it's great to see our First Minister featuring in that as a trailblazer that we all know that she is.
Oh, it's a lovely way to end the evening. My thanks to my guest, Maureen Watt, this evening. And that's it for this evening. But before I go, I would like to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers to enable us to employ staff to make more programmes. Good night, and thank you for watching.